Hello everyone, I am Ertan Karpazlı, your host today. I am the editor-in-chief of Radio East Med, and I am reporting again today from the situation of lockdown here in London, where I'm trying my best to give you monthly updates about what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm going to have to quickly browse through my notes again for this month. As I explained last month, I no longer have direct access to my studio equipment and the studio itself because of the lockdown. So I'm going to do my best. Please excuse any background noise that may come up. I am reporting from my apartment. So without further ado, I want to start off by explaining what's been happening in Syria throughout the month of April and the beginning of May. Now, the conflict in Syria has been going on for the better part of a decade now, and it has evolved into something that does not resemble in any way, shape, or form the conflict as it started around 9 years ago now. I think it might be controversial for me to say this, but I think I do have some kind of justification in saying this, that the Syrian opposition, as we remember it from 9 years ago, is no longer what it was. In fact, you could say it's completely been taken out of the picture. And now the conflict seems to be one between the Assad regime, the YPG forces east of the Euphrates, which were originally backed by the Americans before they pulled out of Syria, and the Turkish-Russian / Iranian cooperation that's taking place in northern Syria. Now, one interesting aspect that I want to focus on in this conflict that's been highlighted in the past month is the evolution of the conflict in Idlib. Now, at the end of February, there was a huge incident where a Russian airstrike killed dozens of Turkish soldiers. Now, these are two countries that are supposed to be working on the same side in the Syrian conflict in order to de-escalate the situation. However, this incident pretty much highlighted the underlying tensions and conflicting interests between Turkey and Russia in northern Syria. And this incident brought about an emergency meeting where the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan went to Moscow and had a meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, where they discussed ways in which they could renew and rejuvenate their cooperation in northern Syria. And the understanding that they came to in that meeting was that the Turks and the Russians were going to continue joint patrols along the M4 highway, which is a highway that connects the city of Aleppo with the city of Latakia, the coastal city of Latakia. And that highway runs just on the outskirts of the city of Idlib, and it has in a way become a border between the Idlib region, which is still very much controlled by anti-Assad forces. Some of them, we could consider them Syrian opposition, which are being backed by Turkey, and some of them either Al-Qaeda affiliated or formerly Al-Qaeda affiliated militant groups. So Turkey has been tasked actually with clearing up the militant groups that are not part of the Turkish-Russian cooperation. So this has put Turkey in a very awkward situation. Now, we do know that there are some Syrian opposition elements that are loyal to Turkey. Turkey has formed an army in northern Syria. They are mobilizing that army. It's a Syrian army, and this army pretty much carries out the commands of Turkey in the region. But there is the most dominant group in Idlib is HTS. Now, HTS was formerly known as the Nusra Front, and it was very well known that the Nusra Front was an affiliate of Al Qaeda in Syria. Now, while the Nusra Front was the Nusra Front, Turkey was making efforts in order to encourage them to split off from Al Qaeda and join the mainstream Syrian opposition. Now, the Nusra Front at first resisted this request because they were very heavily bound to Al Qaeda. But after a while, the Nusra Front started to see the sense, the political sense it made for them to cut off from Al Qaeda and basically reform their image as a Syrian opposition faction. However, they even though they did split up from Al Qaeda and they rebranded themselves, they've changed their name twice since, and now they're known as HTS. Even though they have, at least on paper, they've split off from Al Qaeda, they have failed to join the mainstream Syrian opposition. And in that region, at least, the mainstream Syrian opposition is now part of the forces that Turkey is mobilizing. So this HTS group has split off from Al Qaeda, and they are still fighting against the Assad regime. But they are resisting joining forces loyal to Turkey. Now, HTS has not sought out any direct confrontation with Turkey, but the situation has come to such a point now that HTS is torn between its role as a Syrian opposition faction independent of any other faction in the region, or becoming part of a mainstream Syrian opposition, which is going to most likely be modeled after a secular model, which obviously goes against the intentions of why HTS is actually there in the region, because HTS, for better or worse, is there to establish some kind of Islamic system, or at least based on their interpretation of Islam. Now, this situation has brought about some kind of conflict between the Turkish-backed forces and HTS. HTS has been mobilizing civilians who are against the Turkish-Russian pact in Idlib. They've been mobilizing civilians to protest against the Turkish-Russian joint patrols on the M4 highway. So this has brought about a situation where Turkey is in direct conflict with HTS, but HTS is trying to deflect and defer that conflict. And at the same time, Turkey as well, they don't want to get too involved in the conflict with HTS, because it will be a distraction, a distraction away from the conflict with the Assad regime. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the HTS faction is still very popular in Idlib. So Turkey does not want to turn the population, the masses of Idlib, against itself. However, HTS does not have everything under control, from what it seems, because the situation that HTS has been put in is causing many defections away from HTS. Now, HTS, when they split off from Al Qaeda, they had to shed some skin, because, for example, many groups who were still loyal to Al Qaeda, the main one being Khurasaddin, translated into the guardians of the religion, they decided to split off from HTS. They decided not to make the transition away from Al Qaeda, and Khurasaddin are still very much operational as an Al Qaeda proxy in northern Syria, and Khurasaddin have not shied away from getting involved in direct conflicts with Turkish-backed forces and with Turkish forces themselves. Now, what HTS is trying to do is they're trying to mediate the situation in a way. So HTS is basically saying that, look, we don't want to join the Turkish-backed forces, but at the same time, we don't want anyone else to fight against the Turkish-backed forces. So HTS has actually been in conflict with Huras ad-Din and similar groups to Huras ad-Din, in order to sideline them and subdue them, to quell any kind of conflict in the region, which would basically bring about the end of HTS itself. Because if it does become a huge conflict, if it does polarize the society even more, then HTS is going to become irrelevant. Those within HTS who are closer to the Turkish agenda in northern Syria will split off and join the Turkish-backed forces, whereas those who are closer to its traditional roots in Al-Qaeda will split off and join groups like Huras ad-Din. So it is a very complicated and a very delicate situation in northern Syria at the moment along that M4 highway. From another angle, the Syrian civil conflict is also developing and evolving in another way. Now, Bashar al-Assad, the regime leader, has been the strongman of throughout the entire Syrian civil conflict. He looked like he was on the back foot until the Russian intervention came to his aid, bolstered his forces, and forced the Syrian opposition into retreat. However, now there has been a split that is starting to emerge between Russia and the Assad regime. Now, the Assad regime has not just enjoyed support from Russia, the Assad regime has also enjoyed support from Iran. Russia and Iran have been cooperating on the same side in Syria, because they both have joint interests. They both have joint interests in maintaining some kind of corridor to the Eastern Mediterranean. So for Iran, they have formed a Shia corridor which runs through the majority landmass of Iraq, which is ruled by a Shia majority government, and the Assad regime. Now, the Assad family themselves are part of the Alawite sect of Islam. It is a Shia sect of Islam, so they are natural allies for the Iranians. At the same time, the Russians have been supporting the Alawite sect, have been supporting this Alawite regime led by the Assad family, because the Assad family is guaranteeing Russia's interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, guaranteeing them access to the naval base in Latakia, which Russia basically needs in order to continue any kind of operation, any kind of presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Assad regime has been providing both of these countries with security for their national interests, and in return, the Assad regime has been receiving help from these countries to win the Syrian civil conflict. However, at times where Russian and Iranian interests can conflict, the Assad regime has been torn between its loyalties. Now, the way Russia sees it, Russia has been the one that has won the war for the Assad regime, because Russia has been the one that's given it the most support, not only militarily, but also diplomatically as well. Whereas Iran has been more focused on its own interests in the region, supporting its own proxies, Shia proxies, which does not bode well for countries such as Turkey and countries such as Israel, which both have their eyes on what's happening on Syria. Now, obviously, Russia has good diplomatic relations with Israel, and at the same time, Russia needs to work with Turkey in some way, shape, or form to restore some kind of stability in Syria. So Iran getting involved and irking these two nations puts Russia in a very difficult position, and Russia has to really decide who does it need more in order to restore stability in this conflict. Does it need to work with Iran a lot more, or does it need to work with Turkey? Does it need to work with Israel? So Russia is in a sticky situation, a difficult position, and it seems that since Turkey has insisted on being involved in this conflict and has insisted on its own interests, Russia has been drawn a lot closer to working with Turkey, rather than working with Iran. We can actually see a more direct cooperation between Turkey and Russia in northern Syria, whereas Iran is just kind of there doing its own thing and bringing about Israeli airstrikes, which recently have struck as north as Aleppo, which is an interesting point because I don't believe we've seen Israeli airstrikes in Syria that far north up until a few days ago. In fact, the Israeli airstrikes have been mainly focused on the south, a lot closer to their own borders. But Israel has made it clear that they do not want Iranian involvement in Syria, and Russia is starting to play the game as well. They're trying to decrease Iranian involvement, so there is a lot of pressure on the Assad regime to cut off Iran and to make Iran leave Syria, make Iranian agents and operatives and military advisors to make them leave Syria and have Iran retreat back to its own borders. But the Assad regime cannot necessarily afford to do this right now because the Assad regime needs whatever help it can get. Because Syria right now is in the midst of a huge economic crisis, one of the worst of its kind. And I discussed this in a previous podcast where I mentioned that the economic crisis in Syria has proven that Syria as a country cannot function unless it is restored to its traditional borders, including the east of the Euphrates, where most of its oil fields are. If Syria is just limited to the west of the Euphrates and basically where the Assad regime controls, even though it does have the ports of Tartus and the ports of Latakia access to the open seas, this is not enough really for the country of Syria to function. This is the reason why the Assad regime has been so aggressive in its assault on the M4 and M5 highways connecting Damascus with the commercial capital of Aleppo in order to speed up and in order to rejuvenate domestic trade within the country. Because the control of those roads are very vital for the state of Syria to continue to exist. So the Assad regime is getting desperate for whatever money it can get, for any support it can get in filling its own borders in a way. And at the same time, the Assad regime, the Assad family rather, is starting to see cracks in its unity because of this economic crisis. Now, one thing that the Assad regime has been doing in order to bolster its resources, its financial resources, is they have been heavily taxing and eliciting financial support from the few millionaires, billionaires that Syria has left. And they have been targeting actually Assad's cousin Rami Makhlouf, who he's a very well-known businessman in Syria. He's a telecoms tycoon, has a lot of money, and the family of Bashar al-Assad have set up a system in which Rami Makhlouf's businesses and employees are being targeted, arrested, probed. And Rami Makhlouf, from what I've read, has actually fled to the UAE. And from there, he has been releasing videos criticizing Bashar al-Assad directly. Now, the reason why Rami Makhlouf has been targeted, in fact, Rami Makhlouf, we have to remember that he was a huge supporter of the Assad regime. He is still very much part of the system that Bashar al-Assad leads. In fact, he helped create that system, him and his family. But now that the economic crisis is hitting Syria, the playing field, so to speak, of economic activity in Syria has narrowed, and there is a lot more competitiveness to control resources in Syria between those who have it. and that has actually brought Rami Makhlouf, Assad's cousin, to loggerheads with his wife Asma al-Assad, who also has business interests. So now that the playing field has narrowed, these two business factions are starting to step on each other's toes. So obviously Bashar al-Assad is siding a lot more with his wife in this competition, and Rami Makhlouf is finding himself getting sidelined. So we're seeing now cracks starting to develop within the Assad regime, within the Alawite sect even. The Alawite sect is not as united as we originally thought them to be, which could actually wind up playing to what Russia seeks to achieve in Syria. Now, not too long ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, he came to Syria, he visited Syria, and he visited the Orthodox churches in Syria. Now, we have to remember that Russia is an Orthodox Christian country. Syria is also home to a sizable Orthodox Christian minority, which is probably on par with the Alawites. So I see that Russia would prefer to work with the Orthodox Christian community than with the Alawites. Now, up until now, many of the minorities in Syria, the religious minorities in Syria, have been united behind the Assad regime, because the Assad family have been the strongest, they've had the strongest support network in order to maintain Syria as a stable state. And all of these minority groups, even though they have differences between themselves, they are united in the fact that they do not want to see a Sunni Muslim majority coming to power in Syria, because that way these minorities see themselves as getting weaker in the face of a majority ruling the country. So the minorities have been united behind Assad. And I believe that the minorities of Syria will continue to stay united, Alawis and Orthodox Christians alike. However, there may be a shift in the power balance within the regime. We may see Alawites who are closer to Iran taking a step back, while the Orthodox Christian community of Syria, supported by Russia, may step forward. Now, I'm not saying that Assad is going to get replaced by an Orthodox Christian leader, because I do not see the majority of the Syrian people who are Muslim accepting an Orthodox Christian leader, but I do see the Orthodox Christian community playing a greater role in the future of the leadership of Syria. Perhaps we might even see a Sunni Muslim leader of Syria who is a socialist and who is working with the minorities. Therefore, the majority won't have a problem with a Sunni Muslim leader, but many of his advisors and many of the businessmen close to him may be from the Orthodox Christian community. In fact, there is talk of removing Bashar al-Assad completely, and forming a new political coalition in Syria that will replace him, which will include Alawites, elements of the Assad regime without Assad, and elements of the moderate Syrian opposition. So there is a lot happening in Syria right now, and it's very difficult to say which direction it's going in. We can only take guesses, but it's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on how these dynamics continue to evolve in the future. Now, in last month's podcast, I discussed the economic crisis in Turkey and Lebanon, and this is in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. This has continued to be the case this month, but I'm going to start with Turkey. Now, there have been a lot of reports, I've been coming across many reports in the media about the dire situation that Turkey's economic is facing. Now, the Turkish lira, Turkey's currency, has been declining in value for a number of years now. I remember there was a time where it was 1.9 Turkish lira to the dollar. Now we have surpassed 7 Turkish lira to the dollar, with estimates saying that it will continue to dip to 8 Turkish lira, perhaps even 9 Turkish lira to the dollar. So the Turkish economy is heading downhill, and it has been doing so for a number of years. And there seem to have been many efforts on behalf of Turkey in order to either slow down the economic downturn or reverse it, but none of that has seemed to work. A couple of years ago, the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan chose his son-in-law and former energy minister Berat Albayrak to take over the finance ministry of the country, and it was in 2018 where the Turkish government themselves started to acknowledge that, hold on, this is a problem, and we need to start reassuring investors and businessmen in Turkey that we are on top of this problem. So Berat Albayrak, the finance minister, who had just started his job back then, came out and made a public speech in which he tried his best to outline his plans for economic recovery. However, when he was making that speech, literally at the moment he was making that speech, US President Donald Trump, on the other end of the Atlantic, was announcing sanctions targeting certain Turkish ministers over the imprisonment of a US pastor in Turkey. And that announcement literally caused the dollar to spike against the lira. It only lasted a few days before the lira started regaining and going back to its normal trajectory, but the trajectory it was on was not a good one. Now, the speech that Donald Trump made that spike happen, and it caused a lot of panic in the Turkish markets, but then that panic died down. But now we have seen, without the intervention of Donald Trump and US sanctions on Turkey, we've seen the Turkish lira decline and the US dollar go up to the same point that it was at back in 2008 when that panic first set in. And the difference is now, obviously, this has not been a panic, this has not been a dip induced by any kind of speech by a US president. This is just the trajectory that Turkey has been on for a number of years now, and that trajectory is continuing. So it is going to get even worse. In Turkey, prices of food and prices of medicine, they really shot up over the past year. People are starting to struggle. Unemployment is getting out of hand. So nobody seems to see any solution to what's happening. And the most obvious solution for any country, just as Lebanon has done, would be to get a loan from the IMF in order to help restore some kind of growth. However, we have to keep in mind that President Erdogan has been surviving this long as a leader of Turkey on the premise that he has actually paid off Turkey's debts to the IMF previously. Before he came to power, Turkey was heavily in debt to the IMF. Turkey had just come out of a huge economic recession back in the year 2000 roughly, and then Erdogan was elected prime minister in 2002. And for the most part of Erdogan's reign, Turkey has been on the economic uphill. They've actually been improving economically. He's helped develop the nationwide infrastructure. Up until around, I'd say, 2012 or 2013, Turkey was going in the right direction in terms of its economy. But there were certain reforms to the economy that he failed to make. For example, its heavy dependence on construction, which just continued going on and on and on. And there were a lot of warning signs back then that this is a bubble that's about to burst. Around 16% of Turkey's economy, GDP, was dependent on the construction sector. So it seemed that there were a lot of construction projects, which at first was fine because Turkey really needed to upgrade itself, really needed to upgrade its infrastructure. But then it just got to the point of, okay, so Erdogan has built a new palace. Did he really need to build a new palace? Okay, they're building this great big mosque in Istanbul, the biggest in Turkey, but is it really necessary? These construction projects have continued, and they're still ongoing. Yet people no longer have the money that they used to in order to buy properties. In fact, a lot of the latest luxury properties that have been developed are getting snapped up by foreigners, by people from outside of Turkey, because local people, Turkish people themselves, can no longer afford to buy these properties. I'm going on a tangent here, but the problem is that the thing that I'm trying to highlight is that there have been many problems with the Turkish economy that have existed since before Erdogan came to power. That have not been addressed. They've been swept under the rug, and now there's no more room under the rug to sweep these problems. It's now time that these problems are addressed, and it seems that no one knows how to do that. Now, Erdogan is going to resist taking any kind of loan from the IMF, because if he was to do so, he'd be undermining his whole political narrative. Being that he's been the one that's paid off Turkey's former debt to the IMF. And the situation is quite dire because since the beginning of 2019, the US dollar foreign currency reserves in Turkey's central bank have depleted from $65 billion to, from what I read, is now about 25 billion. And we have to keep in mind that about 20 billion of that has been spent just this year, just since the beginning of this year up until the end of April. Those first 4 months, in the first 4 months of this year, Turkey has spent around 20 billion US dollars just to shore up the Turkish lira, and it hasn't worked. And in fact, some people are saying that the reserves, the central bank's actual reserves, could be as low as $1.5 billion. And they are just constantly circulating money in the country with privately owned banks in order to make it appear as if there is no problem in the central bank. In fact, one report that I read earlier this week was that for at least a very short, brief period of time, the central bank reserves of foreign currency had dipped below zero to minus $2 billion. So I'm not an economist. I'm not going to comment. I don't really know what's going on there. But the fact is that there is a problem. Constantly injecting US dollars to shore up the Turkish lira is not working. And Turkey is in need of cash desperately right now. They can get sources of support, donations from Qatar, as they have done so previously when the US President Donald Trump made that speech and Turkey needed fast cash. Qatar was there to help them. But I don't think Turkey can completely rely on Qatar to bail them out every single time. Turkey needs to have a game plan of its own. So one idea that has been floated now in Turkey is some kind of foreign currency exchange deal with the US, in which the US will buy Turkish liras, bring it to the US, and in return the US will give Turkey more US dollars. Now again, I'm not an economist. I don't know how this works, if it will work. It's not my place to comment on that. But one thing I can comment on as a geopolitical analyst is that the US, first of all, have not been approached for this officially. This request has not been made. It's just an idea that's been floated. But if this idea was to come to fruition, then the US will most likely make some kind of demands on Turkey. Now, before those demands have even been made, it seems that Turkey is starting to understand this and starting to prepare themselves for this. So one way that they're preparing themselves is actually the delay of the activation of the newly purchased Russian S-400 defense missiles, which Turkey bought from Russia. Now, Turkey's purchase of these missiles really angered the US, because the US was arguing that the missile defense system is not compatible with NATO defense systems. And while Turkey's argument was that the whole reason why they had to buy these S-400s was because the US was refusing to sell Turkey US Patriot missiles, which are compatible with NATO systems. So that's a very long-standing argument. That's an argument that's been happening for many years, and Turkey ultimately purchased the S-400s, but they will risk being hit by US sanctions, which they do not need right now, if they activate those systems. So Turkey is delaying the activation of those systems in the hope that they will at least avoid any further sanctions from the US, which would completely obliterate its economy. But one good thing I can say for the Turkish economy is that I do not believe it is in anyone's interest to completely obliterate the Turkish economy, because that would have a knock-on effect. Many countries that have wheelings and dealings with Turkey would feel the impact. One country in particular, a European Union country, Spain, would feel the impact, and then from there it would just knock out many lights across Europe, across the West, and nobody wants to see this kind of mass destabilization happening all at once. I believe that Turkey will get some kind of help, will get some kind of assistance in order to stay afloat. I don't believe Turkey will go bankrupt or anything like that, but they will make sure that Turkey is tied by some kind of chain, some kind of rope, to the interests of the West, to the interests of the US, the transatlantic bloc, the NATO bloc. So this will obviously affect Turkey's role in conflicts and situations, disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean. This could, for example, affect the way Turkey cooperates with Russia in northern Syria. So it's another issue that we definitely need to be watching, another issue we definitely need to be keeping our eyes on, to see how this really affects Turkey's role as a geopolitical entity in the Eastern Mediterranean. And my estimate is that Turkey will have no choice but to go back to the NATO alliance as a fully cooperative partner, and this would definitely bring about problems in Syria, especially regarding its cooperation with Russia. But with NATO support, if Turkey and NATO countries can make peace and put aside the problems and differences that they've had in the past, a greater cooperation between Turkey and NATO could give Turkey the strength that it needs to fulfill its agenda in the region. However, that would definitely come with its limits, as the US interests in the region will definitely take precedence over Turkey's interests in the region. And one way this could happen is by another thing that I should have mentioned when I was talking about Syria, is that the joint coalition that may be formed in Syria once Bashar al-Assad is gone, if that ever happens, could actually include the US-backed SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are largely comprised of the YPG, an offshoot of the PKK, which is considered a terrorist group in Turkey. So we may see even Turkey giving some kind of concessions not necessarily in Turkey, but in Syria, we may see Turkey giving some kind of concessions to the YPG. Now, last month when I was doing my roundup podcast of the month of March, I discussed the situation in Israel in a lot of depth. So, if anyone wants to know what's the background of what's going on in Israel, I suggest you go back to last month's podcast and listen to what I said there. But for this month, I'm just going to quickly go over the latest developments in the disputes that are happening over the new power balance that will emerge from Israel's last election, which happened earlier this year. Now, the last election, which was Israel's third national election in the space of 12 months, did not bring about a clear situation. Yes, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party had the most votes, but they fell short of a majority. Now, on the other side, we had Benny Gantz, leader of the Blue and White Bloc. It was a leftist bloc, which the bloc itself came second in the elections, but was far behind Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud-led right-wing bloc. Nonetheless, Netanyahu could not secure enough support from smaller parties such as the party of Avigdor Lieberman, who is a ultra-secularist nationalist Israeli leader. You would expect that Lieberman would have supported Netanyahu, being that they're both right-wing, but Lieberman seemed more keen to play kingmaker and see Benny Gantz become the leader of Israel. So we had a situation where it looked very much like Netanyahu's days were over, especially considering that he was facing trial for corruption, but that trial has been delayed because of the coronavirus pandemic. So it's brought him a bit of time. But lo and behold, as a shock to everyone, Benny Gantz last month decided to take the position of the Israeli parliament speaker, albeit temporarily. But it showed signs that Benny Gantz was now willing to work with Benjamin Netanyahu to form some kind of grand coalition to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. That at least seemed to be the excuse that was being given in the media. So this was a huge betrayal of Benny Gantz's allies in the Blue and White Bloc. And since then, Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu have been negotiating ways that they can share power within this grand coalition that they're trying to form. And one way that they could do this is through a rotational presidency, which I believe has been, rotational leadership, because we're discussing the position of Prime Minister here. So there's going to be a rotational leadership between Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, with one leader doing the first 2 years and another leader doing the next 2 years. Another concession that the Gantz's side has made demands on is a leading role rather, in the Israeli justice system. At the same time, one red line that Benjamin Netanyahu has put forward is Benny Gantz's support for Netanyahu's plans to annex parts of the Palestinian West Bank. So it seems that, at least from what we're being told in the media, these two sides have made agreements on these issues, and the Israeli court has approved that Benjamin Netanyahu can step forward and form a new government, even though he is facing trial for corruption. So Netanyahu has once again survived. He's been given the green light to form a government, and now he has Benny Gantz, the leader of the Israeli opposition, supporting him. However, being that Gantz pretty much betrayed the Israeli left wing, we're seeing other left-wing leaders emerge, such as Yair Lapid, who has now turned against Benny Gantz and is now taking his place as the leader of the Israeli opposition. And at the same time, Yair Lapid has basically come out and said that he does not want to see Gantz become Israel's new prime minister. So even though we have Gantz and Lapid, both left-wing leaders, Lapid has been so enraged by Gantz's betrayal of the blue and white bloc that Lapid would rather see Netanyahu remain as prime minister of Israel for the time being. Pretty much the same way that Avigdor Lieberman, even though he is right-wing, has so many differences and so much personal problems with Netanyahu that he would rather see a left-wing leader become the prime minister of Israel rather than Netanyahu. In fact, Avigdor Lieberman, the situation being that it is, with Gantz and Netanyahu joining forces, he was hoping to play the role of kingmaker in this election, but now he's pretty much been completely sidelined. And one way that he's tried to remain relevant is that shortly before the Israeli courts approved Netanyahu to form a new government, Lieberman came out, he interpreted one of Netanyahu's press conferences as being an indication that Netanyahu was not interested in a coalition and that Netanyahu was prepared to go to a fourth election. And Lieberman came out and announced himself as a prime ministry candidate for the next elections, which officially has not been declared even. So Avigdor Lieberman, even though he's been sidelined by this situation, is showing signs that he's still very eager to be involved in the game, and he will be very outspoken against any kind of government led by Netanyahu in the future, even though his party only has 7 out of 120 seats in the Israeli parliament. Now, Libya has pretty much dominated many of my podcasts, in fact all of them since I started doing them at the beginning of this year. The situation in Libya continues to persist. It seems that Libya is on the verge of a split because, as we know, we have renegade commander Khalifa Haftar, who has been leading the LNA forces in the eastern side of Libya. The LNA forces being the forces of the eastern government of Libya, which is supported by not only many Libyans, but also supported from the outside by Russia, by France, by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, and particularly by the United Arab Emirates. On the other side, we have the UN recognized government, the GNA government, in the capital Tripoli, which has been besieged for over a year now, but it has received the support of many people within Tripoli, as well as Turkey, Qatar, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, so on and so forth. With now Khalifa Haftar having unilaterally declared himself as the official legitimate leader of Libya, it seemed that really the government in Tripoli was on the back foot, as Khalifa Haftar seemed to enjoy a lot more international support and also controlled most of the Libyan landmass. However, since Khalifa Haftar made the announcement, the GNA has followed through with its promise to launch a counterattack, and it has done so successfully. It has taken back some coastline west of the capital Tripoli, and it is also launching an assault on the Watia airport, which is in the south of Tripoli, and that is the second biggest airport of Libya, after the Mytika airport, which is north of Tripoli, again under the control of the GNA, despite coming under heavy attacks by the forces of Khalifa Haftar, and with the support of Turkish troops in Tripoli, the GNA has been able to preserve its control over that airport. So Khalifa Haftar is falling short really of complete control of the country, without control of the capital city and without control of the two main airports of the country. Ironically, a couple of days after he declared himself leader, having experienced these losses on the west coast of Tripoli and in the Watia airport, Khalifa Haftar, having previously declared the ceasefire process null and void, suddenly comes out and declares a new ceasefire, unilaterally declares a new ceasefire. However, the GNA government of Tripoli has rejected this ceasefire, saying that saying that Khalifa Haftar is just trying to buy time, he's just playing the game, because when he had the advantage, he was rejecting ceasefire calls, yet now that he's on the back foot, having experienced losses, he suddenly decides to call a ceasefire. So the GNA is being resurgent, is proving itself capable to push back Haftar's forces and to gain ground in the Libyan civil conflict. And it is likely that the GNA now will push southwards, actually, south of Tripoli, towards the desert, towards the unpopulated parts of Tripoli. And then from there, they may start moving eastwards and try to besiege cities like Benghazi, which is a stronghold of the LNA government, which is a stronghold of Khalifa Haftar. And this will have a psychological effect, really, on the forces of Khalifa Haftar. Because being that the south of Libya is mainly desert, you're unlikely to get any kind of resistance when you are conducting military operations in that region. It's very easy to take over a huge swathe of land by conducting such an operation, and it will change the colors on the map that show who controls what in Libya, and suddenly it will be shown that the GNA government will control the majority of the country, and that may help them secure more international support, while the LNA will appear to be a minority force, a minority entity holed up in just one or two cities in Libya's east. So I believe that's where the conflict is going to be going in the coming days, weeks, and months. Now, there's certainly a lot more that I could speak about in this month's podcast. Being Lebanon, for example, the situation in Lebanon spiraling out of control. Also, the situation on the Evros border between Turkey and Greece, as well as the continued disputes between Turkey and Greece over the Aegean islands. The announcement by energy companies Eni, Total, and ExxonMobil that they are delaying, they are suspending the drilling activities off the island of Cyprus. Many things that we can talk about, but unfortunately I'm going to have to leave it for now because I do not want to drag this podcast on any longer than necessary. Hopefully this whole coronavirus pandemic will start to ease off after this month, so I'll be able to provide better quality podcasts and focus more on other issues going on in the region. But in the meantime, please, all of you, stay home, stay safe, look after yourselves, and I hope to see you all next month for next month's podcast. This has been Ertan Karpazlı, the editor-in-chief of Radio East Med, delivering for you a roundup of all of the events in the Eastern Mediterranean for the month of April. Thank you very much.